All right, we'll go ahead and get started with the urinary system. So a few objectives to start, like always. We're going to make sure we understand the anatomy of the urinary system, understand the anatomy of a nephron, the functional and structural unit of the kidneys. Make sure we understand the functions of different aspects of the nephron, and then also understand what leaves the body as the form of urine and how it does that. So just to start, a few urinary system functions. There's actually a lot. Most of them are going to be related to the kidneys, but in general, the urinary system is involved in excretion or elimination of metabolic wastes, usually nitrogenous wastes, but also narcotics if they're in excess, or just excess ions such as sodium or potassium as well. It's also involved in the regulation of concentration of solutes, such as the ions, which is why some of it will be left over and we'll excrete that, as well as water. Then there's also regulation of blood volume and pressure, so it's tightly knit with the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. Regulation of pH via different secretion of hydrogen or acidic ions. Regulation of red blood cell synthesis via the production of erythropoietin in the kidneys. We talked about this a little bit with our blood lecture with the hematopoiesis. And then also the kidneys are involved in vitamin D synthesis by activating vitamin D to help calcium be absorbed in the intestines. So looking at the gross anatomy of the urinary system, we'll do it really quickly during lecture here because we'll go into it a little bit more in depth in lab, but we have a pair of kidneys. The right kidney is a little bit lower than the left kidney, and we have two ureters that stem from those kidneys, and those can join into a urinary bladder and then exit via the urethra. And this is the same for males and females up until the following the urethra. Now looking at the kidney from a macroscopic view, we have a few different things that we want to make sure we know for lecture, but then also a few that we're going to touch on that we'll go into more in depth during lab. So this is a frontal section through the kidney, so we're kind of slicing it in half and looking at the inside now, revealing the outer region called the renal cortex, and so that's this region that's circled in red, and then an inner region, and these are called the medulla, and so each single one is a medullary pyramid, so it's in the shape of a triangle, so we'll just call it a pyramid, and it's in the medulla, so it's a medullary pyramid. In between those pyramids, we have renal columns, and this is just connective tissue that are extensions that radiate downward from the cortex through the medulla and help separate most of the characteristic features of the medulla, the renal pyramids and the renal papilla. So the papilla is the end of the pyramid and entering into the calyces. The papillae are bundles of collecting ducts that transport urine made by the nephrons to these calyces, or calyx for single, and they get excreted via this route. The renal columns also serve to divide the kidney into 6 to 8 lobes and provide a supportive framework for vessels that enter and exit the cortex. And then the pyramids and renal columns taken together constitute the various kidney lobes. We won't get into that into much detail. Just understand that there can be up to 6 or 8 lobes of a single kidney. And so some various functions of the kidneys themselves. They're involved in 3 major events that we'll talk about in depth. Filtration, and this occurs in the renal corpuscle that is constituted of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule. And then reabsorption, and this is going to occur in between the renal tubules and the peritubular capillary. So that's what we see in 2 here. Filtered substances from the glomerulus will be reabsorbed into the cardiovascular system in these peritubular capillaries from the renal tubules. And the peritubular capillaries will continue to secrete ions such as nitrogenous wastes and hydrogen ions back into the renal tubules. So that's an event of secretion. And then after everything is done moving back and forth, we have excretion of that substance in the form of urine. So excretion is equal to the filtrate minus the reabsorption plus the secretion. So this is a very crude representation of the events that happen in the nephron themselves, and we'll get into it a little bit more in depth now. So nephrons are the functional units of the kidney. They cleanse the blood and they balance constituents of the circulation. The afferent arterioles form a group of high pressure capillaries that are really small, like 200 micrometers in diameter, and this is called the glomerulus. The afferent arterioles service about 1.3 million nephrons in each kidney, so almost 2.6 million nephrons in between the two kidneys. The rest of the nephron consists of a continuous sophisticated tubule whose proximal end surrounds the glomerulus in a capsule. So this is a very intimate embrace between the glomerulus and this tubule aspect. And we call this the glomerular capsule, and it's also referred to as the Bowman's capsule after the person who found it or discovered it. And so you'll see that go back and forth in the literature. Here it's labeled glomerular capsule, and the next diagram you'll see it labeled as the Bowman's capsule. It's the same thing. It's just the capsule that surrounds the glomerulus, which is this capillary bed for initial filtration here. Okay, so together this is known as the renal corpuscle, the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus. These glomerular capillaries are going to filter the blood based on particle size. After passing through the renal corpuscle, the capillaries form a second arteriole called the efferent arteriole. So it's an artery into the bed and then an artery coming out of it, which is different than what we normally see with capillary bed being a vein coming out on the other side. But this is going to maintain a really high pressure environment, having arteries the entire way through. These then form a capillary network around the more distal portions of the nephron tube. And so moving down this tube, this nephron tube, this is more distal than the glomerular capsule. And so this capillary network is going to form around the tube and end up forming what's called the peritubular capillary network, or peritubular capillaries. And this is going to occur before returning to the venous system. And so all of this is happening and then makes its way back to the venous system. As the glomerular filtrate progresses through the nephron, the capillary networks recover most of the solutes in water that are filtered from the glomerulus and then return them back to circulation. And so the nephron looks really complicated at first glance, but taking it step by step and remembering where each part of the nephron is located will help understand the functional organization of the nephron. And so looking at our whole kidney, and we're looking at one specific lobe, one medullary pyramid, and you can see it's divided into those two different regions. We have the renal pyramid, and then the area associated outside that pyramid in the cortex. Most of the nephron is in the cortex, and you can see that here. Most of the nephron is doing its work in the cortex. It does have some branching down in this loop of Henle into the medullary pyramid that comes back up, and its collecting ducts are mostly in the medullary pyramids, which then get dumped into these calyces, so the minor calyx first and then the major calyx to be excreted as urine. And so the filtration of blood begins in the renal corpuscle in the cortex, circled in red here. And so again, the Bowman's capsule, same thing as the glomerular capsule. It's what's surrounding this glomerulus here. It then continues to the filtering and reabsorption process through the cortex. So we're still in the cortex, the filtering and reabsorption. So filtering initially in the renal corpuscle, and then reabsorption occurring in the tubules. And it does this even though about 15% of nephrons do end up dipping into the medullary pyramids. And these are just known as juxtamedullary neurons. But that's a little bit more in depth than what we really need to know. Most nephrons are just going to maintain most of their renal tubules in the cortex, and then they dump into the renal pyramids via the collecting ducts. And notice that the collecting ducts are found in these medullary pyramids, and this is where reabsorption of water from filtrate occurs, or a lot of it does, the remaining amount. And so blood enters into the kidney through the hilum, and so this is this hilum region where the arteries and nerves and veins enter, and then makes contact with filtration surfaces in the cortex, where it then extends into the medullary pyramid to join collecting ducts that form urine before exiting back through the hilum again in the ureters. And this is, again, a macroscopic view of the nephron, so we can take an even closer look, a little bit more in depth with the nephron. So starting with the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, these make up what is known as the renal corpuscle. And so we're looking at one here, and it's cut frontally, again, just like our original kidney picture, so that we can see a little bit of what's going on the inside. And so again, this is a very highly specialized capillary bed that is high pressure between afferent and efferent arterioles. Notice that the afferent arteriole is really thick in muscles, like surrounding the artery or arteriole, and the efferent is thinner or narrower, and this maintains a higher pressure gradient in here, so we make sure that we're filtering substances through, such as the plasma, filtering substances through into the PCT, or the proximal convoluted tubule, so that we maintain that high pressure environment and we're actually getting filtering done in these kidneys. Surrounding the glomerulus is the glomerular capsule, once again, or the Bowman's capsule, and the glomerular capsule extends into cells called podocytes. And so this capsule is continuous with these podocytes, and then on these podocytes, if we take a little bit closer look, this is one aspect of a chunk of a capillary, and this podocytes surround the capillary, and where the capillaries are open with their little slits, these filtration slits on the podocytes meet up and allow filtration to occur. And these little slits help prevent passage of blood cells and large proteins, thus filtering blood by particle size. So we can look a little bit closer at this filtration membrane.